Without a drum roll, we don't have any drum rolls, unfortunately. Sam, if you could share your screen and start with your presentation for Coral Vita, please.
Sounds good. Thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is Sam Teicher. I'm the co-founder and chief reef officer of Coral Vita, a company that grows corals to restore dying reefs. So we think of coral reefs as one of the most magical ecosystems on the planet. I've been a diver since I was a kid. I find them really one of my favorite places on Earth, but they're also one of the most important. They sustain 1/4 of all marine life, the livelihoods of up to 1 billion people in over 100 nations around the world. And they generate $30 billion a year through tourism, fisheries, and coastal protection. So they are one of the bedrock ecosystems, not only for wildlife, but for humanity as well. Unfortunately, reefs are in really bad shape. Many of you may have heard recent stories about the Great Barrier Reef bleaching. We've already lost half of the world's coral reefs, and we're currently on track to lose over 90% in the next 30 years. So this is not a problem for the future. It's one that's happening right here before our eyes. And one of the biggest drivers moving forward is warming and acidifying oceans from climate change. Now, over the past 2 decades, we've seen coral reef restoration emerge as a viable field to help protect reefs. Now, the best thing by far is to stop killing them. We need our leaders to end pollution and overfishing and put meaningful climate change measures in place. But we also need to scale up adaptation solutions in the meantime. Now, while coral restoration has shown success around the world, I myself set up a traditional NGO grant-funded project underwater while I was living in Mauritius after college. The current model has some serious limitations. There are a few coral species you can grow, really only the fast-growing ones. Little can be done to strengthen the coral's resiliency to warming and acidifying oceans. Setting up and maintaining one of these underwater gardens near every reef around the world just doesn't scale. And then the limitation on grants and donations really hinders the ability for us to achieve what's needed in terms of ecosystem scale restoration. That's why Coral Vita is designing a new model, commercial land-based coral farming, to scale reef restoration to the levels needed to preserve them for future generations. So we're incorporating breakthrough methods where we can grow corals up to 50 times faster, strengthen their resiliency to climate change threats, and then improve the genetic diversity of the corals that we grow at our farms. So to start with, microfragmenting. Corals normally, this branching species I mentioned before, can go from a cutting the size of your thumb to your hand and wrist in 6 to 9 months, whereas the bouldering species could take 25 or 50 years to grow. By cutting up the corals into these little pieces, it triggers a healing process. The corals will then fuse back into themselves, and now we can grow these important species in months instead of decades. We also are incorporating sexual breeding methods. We're actually here at our farm in Grand Bahama preparing for next week's August full moon coral spawn. And by cultivating coral genotypes in our lab, we can improve the genetic diversity for the reefs we restore. And then by having the system on land, we have control over temperature and acidity. And so what we can do is actually mimic future ocean conditions and strengthen the corals, almost like taking them to the gym, so that when we outplant them, they survive better. So with this, we're also doing an entirely new business model. So looking at that value behind reefs, we sell the service of reef restoration to hotels, developers, insurance companies, governments. Everyone that depends on those ecosystem services can hire us to restore the reefs they depend on, while at the same time our farms on land serve as both education centers for local communities and then also revenue generating tourism attractions where folks can pay to enter the farm, adopt coral, or go out and even plant them with our team. And in the age of COVID, we're exploring digital options like partnerships with Airbnb to do virtual farm tours and still continue deriving revenue from this ecotourism space. So we started off with our pilot farm in Grand Bahama, where I'm calling in from right now. We raised a seed round to get that going, partnered with the local port authority here, got all the permits we needed from the Bahamas government, and really started becoming recognized as a pioneer in this space. On the ecological side, we grew 24 native species at our farm. That's up to 7 times more than most Caribbean restoration projects. And then with that coral spawning last year, in the wild, it takes about a million eggs to produce 1 new adult coral genotype. We got that ratio down from 1,000,000 to 1 to 100 to 1. And then on the business side, we had thousands of students and tourists coming through the farm in the few short months. It was opened before Hurricane Dorian last year. So it became a popular site for educational programming in the local community, while negotiating contracts with local developers as well as the cruise industry in terms of making our farm both the destination and then hiring us for restoration contracts. So right now, we've decided out of Hurricane Dorian and the success we had to take our farm to the next level and put us on the path to scaling this solution globally. So from the pilot farm that we previously launched, we're now preparing to expand this into the largest coral farm in the world, growing 100,000 or more corals every year. For perspective, the biggest project ever was grant funded once, 40,000 corals, and then the grant expired, that was the end of the project. So more than double that on an annual basis. And then put farms like that in every country with reefs around the world, really helping scale this solution to the levels needed to keep reefs alive. To wrap up, our team, I previously helped launch a UN-funded coral project, along with serving at the White Policy. My co-founder, Gators, worked on international development projects in Peru, South Africa, and Brazil. We have a seasoned team of restoration experts, not only here on our staff, as well as being advised by some of the world's leading coral scientists, prototypers in engineering, like Tom Chi, the co-founder of Google X, as well as business experts to help us really navigate this transformational process of taking restoration to this scale. So we're raising $2 million right now to fulfill that farm expansion. We've raised $400,000 thus far, and actually just signed terms on $1 million contracts. We're about 75% of the way there, and are really excited to really take this project forward here in the Bahamas, and then again, moving this to countries around the world. And we really appreciate your time for tuning in, and look forward to planting corals with all of you one day soon.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn questions over to each of the judging panel. Mimi, if you want to go first.
Yes. Sam, can you tell us about the current pilot you have in the Bahamas and the scope of that?
Yes, so we built it less with the intention of proving out any new science. We're incorporating these methods that work. We've got a number of R&D projects that we plan on pursuing, but using proven science and establishing our restoration track record and then the ability to generate revenue. And so this scale facility is capable of growing 20 to 30,000 coral fragments a year, and almost think of that analogous to sort of saplings for trees. The pilot, we grow corals in a 6 to 12 month cycle. Obviously right now we're not open to tourism. Bahamas just went into lockdown again because of COVID. We're also preparing for another hurricane.
So can you tell me how much that equates to acreage?
Yes, so it is contextual in terms of the local conditions. We always assess sort of what's needed at the reef, but typically it's 5,000 corals per hectare. So that would let us grow roughly about 4 hectares worth of reef for restoration.
And then are you paid for this pilot?
Right now we raised our seed round initially to fund operations and the construction of the facility. We are negotiating contracts actually with the Bahamian government right now, and are also, we put on hold conversations with developers from last year who were really interested. Dorian came and then COVID, but they still remain interested in hiring us for restoration services, as well as working with local tourism operators and the cruise lines who are planning on marketing our farm as a attraction to their guests. Obviously with that being on hold right now, but the interest from senior executives there.
Okay, and what's the revenue for that if you're talking to developers, for example, or these resorts?
For our current pilot scale, or when we get to the large scale farms?
When you get to the large scale, what's your revenue model?
So operationally, we estimate that a large scale farm would be able to generate over $400,000 a year simply through site visits, by people paying the entrance fee, not adopting corals, which we've already generated tens of thousands of dollars in from little marketing, or paying to sort of go out and plant corals. Then the restoration service contracts, it depends on the local situation as far as if we're selling to hotels, governments, is it a small reef project or like miles of coastline. But a large scale farm, we estimate being able to generate at least $1 million in revenue every year from those restoration contracts, and possibly more.
All right, thank you, Sam. Lucas, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I wanted you to dive a little bit more. I have, I guess, a couple questions. A little more into your true beachhead strategy on on revenue? Is it just specifically the farms and everything else is kind of gravy? Like what, and then what are the actual metrics? Like what is the, how challenging is it for you to actually get one of these cruise liners to actually partner with you, and how much revenue does that specifically bring to the actual farm, and kind of all that kind of fun stuff?
Yeah, sure. So I just was sort of touching, I guess, on the ecotourism side. I'll start there. We had the head of shoreline excursions for Caribbean for Carnival at our farm last summer, basically saying in 6 months' time, that's their cycle, we want to market this to our guests as a farm. We would then sort of estimate what the percentage of guests who spend money on ecotourism activities in a place like Grand Bahama is, and we broke that out to be several $100,000 in revenue year on year, and on that kind of project. If we were in a place like Cozumel, where they've got millions more cruise ship passengers every year, that likely could be higher. So it does depend on the location. And as far as illustration contracts, it's a longer timeline. That's why being able to we have to grow corals for the projects anyway, so we might as well monetize that so we can sort of rely on constant funds from ecotourism to pay for things like OpEx. The restoration contracts, we're already talking not only here in the Bahamas, but sort of building out our pipeline for the future. We have interest from luxury hotel chains in the Maldives, talking to island nation heads of state and senior executives in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, folks in the Middle East. Senior executives at the reinsurance industry is actually very keen on the coastal protection value of reefs. On average, a healthy reef reduces wave energy by 97%. So they're looking to pilot schemes where basically if a hotel owner on the coast pays to restore a reef, let alone the benefits that they could get for tourism, they would then see premiums drop in their plans. So looking at those kind of market drivers, we think that really opens the door for restoration service contracts, as we then, as I said, sort of generate money daily from the ecotourism activities.
What about the adoption piece? So cruise lines, obviously, I mean, they're not going to be back for at least a year or two.
Right.
But I feel like the partnership piece is like the adopt a coral thing is a very interesting driver. And then you could do something similar to what like Ten Tree does, where it's like every time you buy a piece of branding, we plant a tree. Like what partnerships have you explored with other brands to be able to do something like that, which could be one of your biggest revenue drivers, especially now that we're all stuck inside?
Yes, definitely while we're all stuck inside, and I think while people are looking to sort of look for hopeful things, that's actually kind of one of our big focuses in the next few months. Once we get through this spawning cycle, we've already have planted a few seeds and have ongoing conversations with brand partnerships about how, whether it's eco swimsuit wears, not as much yet in the major corporations, though we're starting those conversations. There's an organization that, Sugi Tree, that is fostering restoration of terrestrial ecosystems and now marine ecosystems, and they're going to be giving us a portion of the funds that they raise, together with actually just doing a direct adopt a coral campaign via our own marketing. So we've actually already started doing the demographic data collection and SEO stuff to prepare ourselves for whether it's a crowdfunding campaign or actually putting in a marketing budget, because thus far we've generated tens of thousands of dollars from Adopt a Coral really just by word of mouth and with little attention paid to it. And rightly, as you said, we think that that could be a huge revenue driver and a way to build out our brand and raise awareness about our work. So it's going to be a big focus for us moving forward.
Do you have the specific, because I mean, from my perspective, I think that's going to be your fastest scalable kind of piece for revenue. Do you have the actual metrics associated with it from maybe some of the preliminary stuff that you've done? So like the CAC and LTV associated with like the SEO, like do you know, do you have a general estimation or numbers around that?
Sorry, you broke, what is the metric you actually want an estimate on?
Like CAC LTV for the adoption cycle from like your SEO work.
No, it literally, we were testing that out starting the end of May. We basically put all that on hold because of the protests around Black Lives Matter. We felt it wasn't the right time to be advertising or collecting that kind of data. So that's actually the type of thing that we're going to be picking back up on right now. So we have a rough sense, but it's not anything that I rely on at this particular moment. So I can circle back with you on that though in the next month or so.
Yeah, sounds good. Appreciate it, and great presentation.
Arye, do you have any questions?
Sure, I'll make it pretty quick. Yeah, great presentation. I guess I'm just curious more about going into the technology side of things. And, you know, did you guys have to license any intellectual property from any of these academic labs you work with? And sort of how have you locked down the methodology for creating these fast growing corals?
So thus far, it's all open source. We partnered with the scientists that developed these methods for growing corals faster, and the research in terms of how do you enhance their resilience to climate change is sort of open literature. Obviously, being able to work with the leading scientists helps our ability to then do work on our own. Thus far, though, we have no IP. One of the things that we're planning on doing with this, with funds we already have, as well as with the sort of new raise, is a number of different R&D projects for increasing the efficiency of how corals are outplanted, new substrates for planting the corals on, ways to reduce the labor that's associated with cleaning the corals every day or cataloging their photos. I could keep rattling them off, but that's sort of one arm of what we'll be focusing on. And again, that a land-based farm has to offer is the ability to do much of those R&D projects that most places in the restoration space you're literally pulling off the shelf, and it's the last field that anyone sort of innovates for. So we actually helped create the Coral X Prize that was launched a few years ago, with the intent not only for us being able to go out and compete for it, but the recognition that that's a big space that hasn't been filled and that we are going to be tackling. So that's kind of where we're at on the technology piece right now, and the way we're thinking about it moving forward.
Yeah, the only other thing I just want to quickly ask was, so, you know, you have this methodology for basically quickly regrowing reefs, but what about the sort of resiliency aspect? Because obviously if you have ocean acidification and warming and all that bad stuff happening, then the reefs are going to die anyway. So I guess I'm curious how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, so I alluded to the assisted evolution briefly. First things first, not every reef can be restored. We had a hotel that was interested in hiring us. It was like, we can market to our guests, like snorkel right off. Next to their beach was a river, and upstream was a textile factory. We can't do anything about those corals until the pollutant stops. So identifying the right sites for restoration is key. With the methods that we use, there is research going on right now into how CRISPR can be used for gene editing to boost the resilience of the corals. If that proves viable, we'll be able to incorporate that in, but we're also cognizant of the fact that it's not proven, and we don't also yet know any unintended consequences. So for now, our baseline is we use native coral species, and then the tank that you see behind me, we can not only adjust the corals to live in conditions that are ideal for them out on the reefs right now, but look at what scientific models for temperature or pH are, and gradually raise the temperature, lower the temperature, raise the pH, lower the pH, and basically stress harden and acclimatize the corals. And that's already been shown by other researchers in Hawaii, Australia, Florida, to increase the survivorship of the corals in the threat of climate change looming. So we know that we can do that now, specifically to address the really important question that you're asking.
So Sam, do you have studies to show that?
Yes, I could put that in the chat right now if people want to look, same with the microfragmenting, but the Gates Coral Lab, University of Miami, there's a lot of people who are working on this assisted evolution field.
Yeah, I understand, but do you have studies that show what you're doing, proof of concept with what you're doing with your acidification in the corals in your lab?
We're studying that right now. We're not focused right now on putting out academic research papers.
Do you have white papers?
The method that Dorian kind of delayed things for us as far as being able to collect sufficient data. So we will be creating a white paper, but again, as an example, the system I just described for acclimatization, we have a research partner at the University of Miami. He's already done that multiple times. And so we can refer to those in terms of how it works, and we're using the exact same system. But we do plan on producing our own white papers and sharing some of that research in the future once it's ready.
We have to move along right now. So Sam, if you could unshare your screen, please.